Coming to paperback and e-readers everywhere, East-themed horror of the Hyena Woman. Hell's aspiring angel takes on a wicked werewoman in this action-packed, all-new East-themed series adventure. Pre-order your copy of East-themed horror of the Hyena Woman on Amazon.com today. I was on Facebook the other day when somebody asked the question, why can't the comic book industry produce superstars like it used to? Well, the reason why the comic book industry can't produce superstars like Todd McFarlane, Rob Liefeld, and Jim Lee is because the comic book industry is not the same place it was back in the 1970s and 1980s when it was producing these superstars creators back like your George Perez, John Byrne, and again your Rob Liefeld, your Jim Lee, and your Todd McFarlane. Now, the comic book industry used to be a place where you could go out here and learn a craft, but these days the infrastructure for learning that craft has been torn completely apart. Now, ever since Jim Shooter was fired from Marvel Comics in 1987, the comic book industry has not focused on craft like it used to. Now, before Jim Shooter was fired in 1987, there was a major focus on developing a comic book writer, a comic book artist, or a comic book inker's craft, and there was an infrastructure in place at both your Marvel Comics and your DC Comics to help your writers develop their skills. Now, there were smaller companies like AC Comics, which also had infrastructure in Florida that helped writers develop their craft. And usually, a writer would work on either a small indie book like The FemForce or The Justice Machine, and then they would graduate to working on other comics like Marvel and DC Comics. But once you came into Marvel and DC Comics, you had to learn what they called house style. And you learned house style by becoming an intern in some cases at Marvel Comics. And as you became an intern at Marvel Comics, or you became an entry level writer or an artist, you were taught the basics as related to the foundations of the business. Now, comics are a craft, and the way you learned the craft back before 1987 was you learned at the side of other seasoned comic professionals. That's what they called Marvel Bullpen was all about. It was a place where other writers and artists were trained, working at the side of other seasoned veterans. And as you were working with these seasoned veterans as related to publishing comics, you learned about how story was told inside of a Marvel comic or a DC comic, because the story models for both companies were completely different, and each of them had a standard for what they called house style. So you had to learn how comics were produced the Marvel way, and then you had to learn how comics were produced the DC way. So there was a standard for the whole medium of comics, and you could not just jump in out of nowhere and start producing books out of nowhere. No, you had to learn the house style, and you had to learn the way comics were produced, and you had to learn how comics were put together before you went out here and published anything. So that's a core component that your today's comic book industry doesn't have, and because today's comic pros do not learn craft, that's one of the reasons why we don't produce superstars like they did back in the 70s and the 80s. Now, as you were learning your craft, you were learning the skills on how to produce comics. Now, producing comics is all about you learning about how to tell stories, and you have to learn how to tell a story with both words and pictures. And the pictures have to tell the story before the words. So you have to learn how to make these pictures that are very dynamic single images, and you have to make these dynamic single images move from panel to panel. It's a skill that is a major challenge for both a writer and an artist, and you have to learn how to make those pictures first with words so that the artist has something to understand when it's time to draw the pictures. This was a major skill that I had to learn myself, even though there was no house style. I had to learn it on my own, from learning how to do things from screenwriting, from reading books like Sid Field's Screenplay and Robert McKee's Story, and other screenwriting websites. But today's comic book pros, they don't understand how this is done. They don't really understand that you have to learn how to do these kind of stories and as related to the foundations of the story model, and that's because there's nobody there to teach them how style. Now, many of your comic pros today, they haven't been made to pay their dues, and the way people used to pay their dues in comics was they would start out getting assigned maybe a one-page story, like in the back of a What If, or they would get assigned a four-page story in the back of maybe a Spider-Man or a Hulk book, and then they would graduate to an 8-page story that was featured in an anthology like a Marvel Comics Presents, which was basically a book to see if people's skills were on point. So these are the kind of books that people would go out here and cut their teeth on to learn the basics of storytelling, but Marvel and DC don't produce these type of anthologies anymore for us to see these new artists when they first come out. Now, as your writers and artists are working on these one-page, four-page, and 8-page stories, eventually, if their skills are good enough, they graduate to a full 20-page comic. And back in the day, there used to be the lower tier books like your Alpha Flights, your Infinity Inks, and many others. These would be the books that your creators would go out here and cut their teeth on, and this is where you would see a lot of now known names coming up. Now, back in the day, you would see guys like your John Byrne. He had done multiple issues of books like Iron Fist, and The Champions. And the reason why John Byrne was on that book was because he had just come into the business. So he was just coming into Marvel, and they needed to see how he would tell a story. So they put him on a low tier book to see if he could go out here and tell the story. Now, they knew that the book wasn't going to sell, but the whole point was to see if people would react to this artist and respond positively to him. So that was one of the things that they would do, is they would put an artist on a low tier book to see how the audience would react to them. And many of your very popular artists today, they started out on low tier books. I remember John Byrne starting out on Iron Fist, and also I believe he started out on The Champions. Bob Layton started doing inks on The Champions, which was one of the poorest selling Marvel books. Your Jim Lee started out on Alpha Flight, which was one of the worst selling books in the 80s at Marvel. And your Todd McFarlane started out on Infinity Inc. Many of your favorite comic pros, before they became very popular in the industry, they worked on a lot of low tier books, and they worked on these low tier books in order to showcase their talent, showcase their skills, and they went out here and were trying to build an audience. Because if you can't really build an audience on the low tier books, then there's no reason for editorial to assign you a higher tier book. Nobody starts out working on books like The Avengers or The Fantastic Four, which are considered the A titles at Marvel, or Justice League, or Batman and Superman at DC. No, most people usually start out on lower tier books before graduating to high A-list books. Now, your John Byrne, after doing The Champions, and Bob Layton, after doing The Champions, they graduated to higher tier books at Marvel. John Byrne went on to do the X-Men, which was starting to pick up in sales, and after the sales started to pick up, he then started to rise to stardom. Now, your George Perez started out, I believe, on some books like The White Tiger and others before he graduated to Avengers, and then he graduated to which is considered the top book at the time in the 70s, and you have to work your way up to get to these titles. You just don't come into comics working on the top titles. You have to work your way up in order to build an audience. And that's one of the things that is missing today, because many of today's writers and artists don't really stay on a book long enough to develop their storytelling skills. And because they don't develop their storytelling skills by learning how to go out here and create books from panel to panel, we really don't get to go out here and see what they can do on a page. And what your page is the thing that is going to sell you in comics, but it's hard to sell comics because people don't stay on books long enough to develop their storytelling skills. Usually, if for a creator to build an audience, they have to stay on a book for at least about 24 to 36 issues, but a lot of today's writers and artists don't even stay on a book past maybe 8 or even 12 issues. And that's one of the other problems with today's comic book business. Again, many people don't stay on a book long enough to, one, develop their storytelling skills, and two, they don't stay on a book long enough to develop an audience. Because the whole thing is, if the book is constantly being rebooted or canceled, the audience really cannot form a relationship with the characters. And if they can't form a relationship with the characters in your story, then they cannot get to know what creator created that book. That is something many comic pros really cannot go out here and build on, because editorial keeps canceling their books. And because editorial keeps canceling the books, what happens is you cannot go out here and develop the audience. And if you can't build the audience, you really cannot go out here and build the momentum that you need in order to go out here and become a very popular creator. Because it's very hard to become popular if you can't develop a following, and you can't develop a following if your publisher keeps canceling your book. And every time a book starts to build some momentum, like I remember Mark Waid and Chris Samnee's Daredevil was building some really good momentum, they wound up canceling Daredevil and then restarting Daredevil with Chip Zdarsky. So we went from one writer working on the book, building some strong momentum for 36 issues, then we go to another creator who gets the book, and what happens is the book winds up falling off. And it's hard to build that word of mouth, and that's hard for a creator to go out here and build their brand. I mean, many of these comic book icons that we look at, guys like George Perez, guys like John Byrne, these guys were doing not only their own runs on X-Men, they did books like the Avengers, they did books like the Fantastic Four. I mean, they did lots of books, and they built a reputation. And then they were always, because they were constantly consistent, that's how they started to build up their fan base, because people always saw their art or they saw their stories, and because they were consistent in producing work on the regular, this is how they started to become popular. That your Jim Lee's, again, he started out on in Marvel. I remember his first work on Alpha Flight, and I remember buying him in Alpha Flight. And then I remember seeing him on X-Men taking over for Mark Silvestri. And over time, he was building up his momentum because he had already built up a base from Alpha Flight, moved that over to X-Men, and then became an icon. And I also remember your Rob Liefeld starting out on books like X Factor and other books at Marvel like New Mutants, and he further built momentum. But it's hard to build that momentum because your comic publishers don't allow anything to remain published for an extended period of time. They're constantly canceling books, constantly rebooting books, and many of these books get canceled and rebooted around the 8th or 12th issue, and that's not even any time in the publishing world. Now, in the publishing world, everything goes very slowly, and a comic at its first 3 issues is not in a place where it can generate a really big audience. You really don't start building your audience on a book until maybe the 2nd or 3rd year. And by that time, you're practically near the end of your run in some cases these days. But that's when you really start to build your audience up, because it takes time to build word of mouth. And we don't really allow word of mouth to be built today, because in today's comic book world, everything is online. You go to a place like a Bleeding Cool, or you go to a place like you're bounding into comics, and somebody's writing an article about a comic. And when they start writing these articles, what that does is it cancels the guy's momentum, because people don't really go out here and can go out here and really see the stories, because people are writing articles going out here saying things about the comic pro and not letting their work stand out for themselves. And that's a major problem with today's comic book business, is that we don't really have, people don't, one, pay their dues, they don't really develop their skills or their craft, and they don't stay on books long enough, because the publisher either cancels them, or the book just never really gets the support that it needs. And because the book doesn't get the support that it needs, it doesn't really go out here and become something that becomes popular. Now, that's a big problem today, because again, nobody's really learning craft like they used to. And because people aren't learning craft, they're not learning the skills that they need to remain consistent. And that consistency is what you need to, in order to become a pro that builds a reputation that will make you a star creator. Now, I myself, as a creator, I know that you have to stay in the game with books that are struggling in order to build an audience with them. That's why I never ended the ISIS series or the E-Steam series or the John Haynes series, even when sometimes books like ISIS and E-Steam would not really sell very well in the beginning. I would keep producing the books, because the only way you can go out here and build an audience with the books is by continuing to remain consistent. And that's how you go out here and you build the audience, because eventually what happens is people will eventually find one of the books in the series, and it's one, if people find one book, that will generate the word of mouth that is necessary in order to get other people to go buy the books. And when people go out here and see the word of mouth being built, that's how you start to become popular. And then, as they're buying the back issues, you can go out here and start producing the books on the front. And that's how you go out here and start building that momentum towards becoming a popular creator. But we don't have that infrastructure in place as related to comics, and we don't, that's why we're not producing superstar creators anymore. We don't have the infrastructure in place to create superstar creators. We don't have any focus on craft, and we don't have any place where people can cut their teeth, get some seasoning as related to their skills. That's the big problem with today's editorial at companies like Marvel and DC Comics. There's no place for young talents to rise to the next level. There's no place for there to be people like Dwayne McDuffie to learn their talent. There's no place like for people like your Jim Lees and your Rob Liefelds to learn their talent. I mean, not talent, their craft. And you need a place where people can learn their craft in order to produce quality talent. And you also need a place where that talent can go out here and shine. And that's a big problem with today's comic book business. We really don't have that infrastructure in place anymore. And today's editorial is more focused on social justice than going out here and developing craft. And I really, again, miss the days when we had people in place like Jim Shooter who truly cared about the business and cared about the craft of comics and cared about teaching craft as related to creators, so that they would not make a lot of the mistakes I'm seeing in the business as related to story models, story paradigms, and also seeing mistakes as related to a lot of continuity issues. A lot of these mistakes are due to very inexperienced editorial who really don't understand the business of comics, really don't understand the craft of storytelling, and that's all because most of your companies today, like your Disney and your Warner Brothers, they're all about commodifying these characters and not about developing a base where people learn skills like writing, learn skills like cartooning, and learn skills that they can take from business to business. No, it's all about making a fast dollar and making that fast dollar at the expense of the public by giving them poor quality books. And again, you can't develop a superstar if you don't have a system, and if you don't have a system that allows people to learn what they need to learn, you're not going to be able to produce the talent that becomes the superstars of the next generation. Now, my first comic, Easting No Good Deed, is now available on Kindle for 99 cents. You can find it on Amazon.com by clicking the link in the description box. My second comic, John Haynes at Death's Door, has all of the art completed. I'm just waiting for the cover to be finished, and then I will be able to launch the Kickstarter for John Haynes at Death's Door. So I'm hoping to have that comic available to you soon, and I'm hoping that you guys will put in a pledge when I launch the Kickstarter. But until then, you can pick up many of the books on the SJS Direct imprint, like the ISIS series, the Easting series, the John Haynes series, and the books of the Spinsterella trilogy on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find many of these books on other online platforms like Smashwords, the iBookstore, and Google Play. And if you want to see me make more comic-related videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.
Now available in paperback and e-readers, ISIS Legacy. Sorority secrets of the goddess next door are revealed in this all-new ISIS series adventure. Get ISIS Legacy in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere.